Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm an Airbus pilot, and welcome to our short runway training with the Airbus A319. Now this video is of course applicable to pretty much any Airbus family aircraft, and the same techniques can also be applied with other aircraft like Boeing's. We will be doing this on the brand new mkstudios Key West airport, which has a 1,500 meter runway. Now, as is often the case with such short runways, the length of the runway is usually determined by the surrounding terrain, so that means that there is often no additional space for localizer antennas or stuff, so we will be doing this completely raw data, which is how most of those approaches that would ultimately be flown as RNAV approaches ultimately end up on the short final. Now, I'd say, without any further ado, we get straight into this and talk about a couple of general techniques. Something you will notice with many such runways is that there is no complete touchdown zone as you are used to from other runways drawn in. Instead, we only have a single touchdown zone marker here in Key West, and thereafter remain about 1,200 meters of runway. So a couple precautions that we gotta take for approaches to a runway like this. And the most important one is that we just have to touch down on time. What you would normally do for a landing like this is to determine the latest touchdown point. And for this we are just going to have a look into the EFB to do some landing performance calculation over here. So we will be landing in Key West, runway 09, it's a dry runway. It's most important that you apply the actual latest weather over here, and we will be landing at about 120,000 pounds. Now we are obviously going to go auto brake medium, and we will be doing this with maximum reverse over here. Auto thrust should be set as applicable. Manual thrust decreases the landing distance required, so that is very much recommended. Now you can see we got 5,075 feet of runway available here, which is about 1,500 meters, and we need 4,700. So we've got a stop margin of approximately 100 meters. And, well, that's what we gotta base this on. Now, without that much margin, we have to keep in mind how Airbus designs the landing stages. Namely, it is not the target to touch down on the markers, but much rather Airbus wants you to cross the runway threshold in 50 feet and then touch down 7 to 8 seconds later. So what we are going to do is to aim to do a normal approach, and then we are going to... Hello? Do it like this guy. Fly it right down, just be sure that you don't touch down behind the markers. So yeah, that was a nice demonstration of how you are supposed to do it. The key to all that is obviously a stable approach. So we will be taking that into consideration once we are in the air. Now a small word about taking off on a runway like this. When you do your takeoff calculation, you may even get a flex temperature for a takeoff like this. We did, and there is absolutely no problem using that. The only problem you may encounter on a runway like this is performance limitations, which can mostly be cancelled out by selecting the optimum flap config, which may give you a high flap setting like config 3 for example. Remember when taking off in config 3 that during flap retraction you go from 3 straight to 1. You don't go into a 2 configuration in between, so that's to keep in mind over here. And well, also do use the packs as required. In most cases, turning the packs off is going to give you a little bit of additional margin. In our case here, we did calculate pack off. If we turn the packs back on again, you can see we do lose a degree of flex temperature over here, but for the purpose of traffic patterns that we are going to fly today, I will be entering that. Now the stop margin is something you should always have a look at. You can see right now we got 427 feet, so that's about 100 meter stop margin. So be accurate here. Consider continuing if you receive a failure very close to V1, so that you do not have to stop in the antennas at the end of the runway. And well, that's pretty much all there is to this. in terms of the theory, so let's go ahead and do the same that we recently did on our landing practice video with the Boeing 737. Fly a couple of traffic patterns over here and see how all of this theory looks when put into practice. So, are you ready to go? Then, the parking brake is now released, timing, and takeoff. Stabilized. Manflex 55 SRS auto thrust blue. And thrust set.
Short runway. Short runway.
Yep, RAS does warn us, and that is completely correct. 100 knots, checked. V1, rotate. Positive climb, gear up. One thing you will notice when you're taking off from runways like this is that you are usually going to take off with a lot of excess thrust available. So the initial pitch after takeoff may be higher than what you would find on most takeoffs. Something like 17.5 degrees can easily be seen here. Alright, so speed out start, flaps 1, we keep it in 1 for the pattern, and auto thrust off, flight directors off, bird on, and then we are ready for our traffic pattern. Okay, we're going to start with a right-hand pattern here because of that naval base on the left side that I don't want to overfly. But of course, normally when you are sitting on the left seat, left-hand patterns would be the standard. As we're turning downwind, let's go ahead and discuss a couple of the techniques that we will be using on the approach. And no worries, we will be shooting a second approach where we are going to talk about exactly how to fly those patterns so that you can practice all of that on your own as well. Now, what are we going to do and how are we going to do that? So, the key to any approach, literally to any approach, is that you fly a stabilized approach, and I would really recommend to be stabilized in 1,000 feet and not just in 500, even though it may technically be allowed. This is especially important in the A319, which can be a bitch to slow down at times. Now, for the approach, we have to get on that vertical profile early, be stabilized on the vertical profile by 1,000 feet AGL, and then the most important point is to maintain that profile. The key to that is using the bird on a nice 3-degree descent, so put the wings of the bird on the 3 degrees down here and try to maintain that as stabilized as possible. As always when flying Airbus, the key is really to use as little control inputs as is practical. And that's what we are going to do. So it's kind of a pity that I can't show you the side stick in motion here while we're flying this, but I'm basically doing about 0 inputs. Now, once we are established on the final, we do want to keep our speed in check. Theoretically, you're allowed to go up to 10 to 15 knots above VREF. However, for practical purposes, doing that is going to increase your landing distance, and it's also going to make it a little bit more difficult to flare the aircraft. Now, if you're a little proficient on the Airbus already, I would recommend to do this with manual thrust, since auto thrust has a little tendency to deviate a bit more than what you can normally do manually. However, if you are going to, or if you're not that proficient yet, then do keep auto thrust engaged so that you can focus on the flying part of things in the early stages of the approach here. Now, once we are coming in on our final, we are eventually going to get that airplane stabilized, and then we are eventually nearing the runway. Now, when we're nearing the runway, it is most important that we are stabilized, that we aim for the puppies, but once we are at about 200 feet-ish, we are going to shift our aiming point slightly in front of the touchdown zone markers, so that we are not going to overfloat them. Now, this is going to maybe require a little stronger rate of descent depending on your initial position on the approach, but most importantly here, we should not aim for the aiming points themselves, because otherwise we are guaranteed to overfloat them during the flare maneuver. And if you pass over those aiming point markers, then a go-around will pretty much become mandatory, because it is going to invalidate all of our landing performance calculations. So a little careful there when you are on the very short final. Aim a tad low, just a tad though, nothing significant, so that you can eventually bring the airplane in right onto those markers, or just in front of them. Now, the flare is an especially important part of the maneuver, and we must pay attention that we do not flare the airplane too much in an attempt to make the landing as smooth as possible. Instead, we just break the rate of descent by pitching up, like we would normally do, but then we ensure that we rapidly fly the aircraft down onto the ground. Now, that's pretty much the key here, coming in on speed and not over-flaring the aircraft while aiming for an early touchdown. Let's go ahead and show you all of that in action. Once we have touchdown, we are going to retract those flaps in config 2 and initiate a touch and go, so that we can use the second pattern in order to show you guys how to fly all of that properly, to practice some traffic patterns. Alright, now we're getting a little low on speed. Now I'm supposed to do that either. We are aiming slightly in front of the aiming point here.
100.
Halfway between middle of the runway number and the aiming point right now.
30, 20,
Flare,
3 down.
idle, down. Okay. So, as they say, the smoothness of a landing is not a criterion for a good landing. Alright, go around.
600 meters. Remaining.
Rotate at the previous V approach.
300 remaining.
Positive climb, gear up. So initially we can follow those flight directors, but we will be turning them off in a few moments once we reach acceleration altitude. And here we go. So, pitch down, speed, alt star, flaps 1, and now we are going to keep it in config 1. We are going to fly the level off in 1500 feet over here, and once we've done that, so now we can turn the flight directors off, turn the bird on, set the S speed as target speed, and then either go to manual thrust or keep the auto thrust on. Now let's go ahead and turn downwind and talk about a bit of a setup. So I've already set the entire FMS up on the ground, so that we just need to do the most important points now. So let's go direct, select that center fix with the radial in, insert the direct 2, then we go to performance, activate approach phase, and now that that is done, we can manage our speed, and the airplane is going to target the S speed in auto thrust, or it's up to you to target the S speed and manual thrust. Let's clear up that timer, because we will need that in order to judge our downwind and the base turn. Now, a little bit of theory here for flying traffic patterns in an Airbus. We want to do it at config 1+F, we want to do it right down at the S speed, and we basically want to be 2.5 miles from the center line. By inserting all of that stuff into the FMS, you nicely get your offset indicator down here, and we can basically fly the downwind in order to reach 2.5 miles over here. Those 2.5 miles will provide you a nice little base later on, so that you can nicely time your entire approach. So here we are, nicely on the downwind. So for every 100 feet above the ground, we are going to fly 3 seconds of a downwind timing, minus the wind component if we have a tailwind, or if we have a headwind. So for a headwind, you would extend the downwind. For a tailwind, you would shorten the downwind. So, for example, if we had 10 knots of tailwind right now, then we would fly 35 seconds. Without, we fly 45 seconds, that's 1500 feet times 3. And with a 10 knot headwind, we would add 10 seconds to the downwind. Now, look out of the window, find the runway threshold, which is here, and once we are abeam the threshold, we are going to press that timing. 10 seconds before turning base, we are going to go in config 2 and start slowing the aircraft down, and when reaching the 45-second marker, we will start that base turn, go gear down, flaps 3, eventually flaps 4, and then turn final. A good point to turn final is when you're approximately half the ground speed in nautical miles. So we'll be doing 140 knots at that point. So that's 0.7 miles from the center line. Then you can initiate your final turn and you should be spot on. Alright, we're reaching 35 seconds here. Flaps 2 and idle thrust. Now reaching 45 seconds. Let's turn final. And one last thing I do at this point is to go to the flight plan page and clear that inbound point so that you actually get the distance to the runway on the top of the PFD. So when starting the base turn, we can start a smooth and shallow descent, like 300 feet a minute-ish. Then let's go gear down, flaps 3, spoilers are still armed. Remember, the ECAM memo is going to show up only at 800 feet, so that's going to be rather late. So, we're on a base lag, the runway is in sight, we can also see the poppies already, and make sure to fly ourselves into the poppies here, flaps full. So, ground speed is 140, so at 0.7 miles from the runway we will start our turn to the final, and we can use the distance to the runway up here, like 3.5 miles right now, to judge our altitude. Remember, for every 3 miles, or for every mile you need 300 feet, so roughly 1000 at 3 miles works pretty well. That helps you to judge your descent rate if it's a little difficult to see the runway. In the real world this is much easier because you can simply look outside the window. Okay, so coming up on the final approach. Now we can do some final adjustments over here. We got everything in sight. And now we are going to establish ourselves in the poppy as early as possible. Passing 800 feet, there's our ECAM memo, so that's the landing checklist complete. And now, just like last time, we aim to get stabilized as early as possible, on speed, on altitude, with as little side stick inputs as necessary. Because that's how you fly an Airbus. Okay, we're established nicely on the poppy, and if there was no turbulence at all, then we wouldn't need any stick input at all anymore until we start the flare. Now, of course there's always going to be a bit of a turbulence, so just keep the airplane nice and stable. And especially keep that speed under control so that you don't get too fast here. Alright, the poppy is now showing 3 reds. That's because we are aiming a little low again. As mentioned, somewhere between the number on the runway and the aiming point is going to work pretty well, but be sure that you don't fly yourself into 4 reds, because that would be an indicator for go-around. Okay.
40, 30,
Flare,
20,
idle, don't hold it off, fly it down. And here we are. Alright, spoilers, reverse green, manual brakes. Usage of the auto brake is going to help you, so auto brake medium can certainly be considered over here. Passing 70 knots, we go back into idle, and that's it. Welcome to Key West. So that's pretty much the entire point of the story over here. Maintain the vertical profile until about 200 feet, then establish yourself on a nice 3-degree glide path to a point between the numbers and the aiming point. Then you can start a normal flare at 30 feet, but don't hold the airplane off the ground, fly it into the ground. On a runway like this, positive landings are not a target, but definitely common. Just, you know, don't break the aircraft, but you will normally not have to worry about that. So yeah, that's the entire story behind it. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed this one. As always, leave a like, comment and subscribe, and if you really love what I'm doing on this channel, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me Coffee link in the video description below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next one.